So just the structure of what we'll do, and people watch this stuff online also, so you and I will learn together, is just a little bit of an introduction to the Mussar movement in general. There's wonderful resources about this whole time period, but anything that has a lot of Yiddish literature about it, YIVO is a great resource for that. And they have a ton of information available online, all kind of written by the top scholars in the field. So a lot of the material much of the material that I have here that's kind of just like encyclopedia-y kind of material comes from them, but is written by kind of the experts on the subject. So just like as a really easy way to learn more. So we'll start with an introduction to the Mussar movement, and then we'll look at two kind of schools of Mussar. So we'll look at Navardak and Slobodka. So Navardak, there's many famous students from Navardak, but one of them is a Yiddish author named Chaim Grada, who wrote a short story called My War with Hirsch Rasteiner. And in that short story, he paints a picture of what a Navardak student would look like and what a Navardak lifestyle would look like. So we'll read through some of that together, and then we'll talk a little bit about Slobodka, and then we'll look at a text that is from before. The Mesilat Yesharim predates the Mussar movement, but was one of the very important texts that was studied in these Mussar-oriented yeshivot. So we'll do a little bit of Mesilat Yesharim at the end. Okay, cool. So just as a general kind of word about what the Mussar movement was. So the Mussar movement was founded by Yisrael Salanter, kind of more in the 1840s. And what's interesting about it, as opposed to Chassidut, which we talked about last week, where Chassidut is really steeped in Kabbalah, Mussar has really almost nothing to do with Kabbalah. Mussar is much more psychological than it is, and it's interested in basically psychology and mitzvot and like Ratzon Hashem. It's not interested in like making any like changes to the divinity or trying to even like understand God in that certain way. It's much more about like, there are mitzvot and I am a person, and how do I as a person like most successfully accomplish mitzvot. So here we can just kind of read this. So Mussar is really all about behavior and about attitudes that then kind of lead to behavior. So here, just the second paragraph under the Mussar movement heading. So the key to understanding the emotional spiritual mechanism that leads a person to moral failure is the idea of desire, of tava. Salanter liberated the ideas of desire and evil inclination from the metaphysical baggage that was loaded upon them in Kabbalistic literature. According to him, desire is nothing but the tendency implanted in man from birth to be drawn to what brings pleasure and delight, and to withdraw from what causes pain and sorrow. Salanter does not categorically negate desire, for he does not accept the ethical polarization of matter and spirit, but he regards desire as dangerous because in many cases it moves a person to act in opposition to halachic imperatives. So it's all about, as opposed to Chassidut, which may be less about specifically halakha and more about relationship to the Almighty, Mussar is all about halakha and the preparation of self and the maintenance of self as a person who acts in compliance with halachic imperative. So furthermore, the intensity of desire moves a person to invent rational justifications for deviating from the norms of halakha, and it is this tendency that Salanter identifies as the evil inclination. So Salanter is not here to say, oh, there's a yetzer hara that has this like outside effect on you. He would say, no, people are born with these desires to gravitate towards pleasure and to gravitate away from pain, but that's those desires need to be tamed because it's not about pleasure and pain, it's about fulfillment of mitzvot. And so we need to break out of the pleasure and pain pushes and pulls on our lives and retrain ourselves to follow the norms of halakha. And the way to do that is by actually spending time on this retraining. So the Mussar movement comes out of like Eastern Europe, a lot of Lithuania, and these Lithuanian yeshivot where they were trying to say, yes, we're studying Talmud full time. Of course we're studying Talmud full time, but in order to study Talmud full time and have that lead to something that's not just like intellectual fun of studying Talmud, we have to also invest in studying these Mussar texts, like the Mesilas Yesharim, which we'll look at in the end, which will then enable us to kind of live this out in our lives as lives of people devoted to the norms of mitzvot, and not just people who like to study. But when Mussar was, and we'll talk about this, we'll read about this a little bit more when we talk about Slobodka, but Slobodka was a place, for example, where when Mussar was introduced, was kind of brought in heavily into the curriculum, they had a really hard time finding faculty. There was an uprising at Slobodka to say, like, this is not something that's worth spending time on. And only over time, the Mussar movement faced rather significant pushback by people saying, no, like all we do is study Talmud. It's not a good use of time in yeshiva to study anything that's gonna like shape us into people who can like live these halachic lives or be better people. And so Slanta really faced this kind of uphill battle, and his students who founded the three main Mussar yeshivot of Kelm, Navardak, and Slobodka faced this really uphill battle in terms of bringing this perspective into their yeshivot. But they had it. But we'll see when we talk about Slobodka, especially, we'll talk about some of the people who studied in Slobodka, and they're some of the biggest names in like pre and post World War II European yeshivot. So really, their influence eventually was quite vast. Okay, so let's talk about Navardak. So Chaim Grada, I mentioned, is a Yiddish writer and poet. Under Navardak here, I just have a little bit of a biography of him. So beginning at age 13, Grada was shuffled between various outposts of the Navardak Mussar Yeshiva, receiving a particularly extreme form of religious education that strove to educate the moral personality through self-abnegation and intense self-analysis. So the joke about Navardak is that in Navardak everyone walked around like this, and in Slobodka, which we'll talk about after, in Slobodka everyone walked around like this, with these very different ideas about how to achieve the goals of Mussar. And in Navardak it was all about self-abnegation, the sense of like, I'm a nothing, I'm a terrible. There's also like the classic Navardak joke is like some guy comes in and says, I'm a nothing and I'm terrible, and people look at him and say, look who thinks he's a nothing. That was kind of what was prized, was this like intense self-abnegation. So just to keep reading about Grada for a second. So though Grada excelled as a student, he was denounced for secretly reading secular literature and for trying his hand at poetry. He was also deeply influenced by his experience as a student of Avram Yeshayahu Karlitz, better known as the Chazon Ish, the outstanding Talmudic scholar who was beloved in Vilna due to his scholarship, modesty, and compassion. Much of Grada's later writing negotiates his conflicted allegiances to the models of, his father was a Moscow. His father was one of these like Enlightenment Jews, but his father passed away when Grada was very young. So he had this kind of, he was like torn between these Orthodox yeshivot that he was part of and also his father's kind of Enlightenment legacy. So I want to read together. I brought kind of a lot of it, so we'll see how far we get. But his work, it's a short story. The English translation of it was published in Commentary, which means it's actually available for free online. That's where this translation comes from. There's certain like better and worse translations. And one thing I'll just say by way of background, which is that people who study Yiddish literature, I heard Dara Horn speak about this like very compellingly one time. It's really hard to translate because it's really hard to translate from a Jewish language to a not Jewish language. So when you have a piece of literature that's in Yiddish, or nowadays when you have more Hebrew literature also, when you translate, you lose all of the resonances of the language. You lose the ability to kind of freely sort of quote Tanakh just as part of your writing, or to use words that connect to here and to here and to here and to here and to here in the Jewish library, because English doesn't have those kinds of Jewish library resonances. And in fact, like, there's certain English words that are hard because, let's say you want to use the word chen, the Hebrew word chen. So we would normally translate that as grace. But the minute you use in English the word grace, you actually open up this whole world of Christian references and Catholic understandings of what grace is. So it's hard to translate. It's hard to translate literature well into English from these like Jewish languages. So I'll just say that by way of introduction. But hopefully it will give us a little bit of. It just paints a picture in a way that's kind of fun. Okay, so my war with Hirsch Rasaner. Okay, so I'll just read. In 1937, I returned to Bialystok, several years after I had been a student in the Novardok yeshiva of the Mussarists, a movement which gives special importance to the ethical and ascetic elements in Judaism. When I came back, I found many of my old schoolmates still there. A few even came to my lecture one evening. Others visited me secretly to keep the head of the yeshiva from finding out. I could see that their poverty had brought them suffering, and that the fire of their youthful zeal had slowly burned itself out. They continued to observe all the laws and usages meticulously, but the weariness of spiritual wrestlings lay upon them. For years they had tried to tear out of their hearts the desire for the pleasures of life, and at last they realized they had lost the war with themselves. They had not overcome the evil urge. There was one I kept looking for all the time and could not find, my former schoolmate Hirsch Rasaner. He was a dark young man with bright downcast eyes. I did not meet him, but heard that he kept to his garret in solitude and did not even come to the yeshiva. Once we met unexpectedly in the street. He was walking with his eyes lowered, as is the custom with Novardok Mussarists. They do not wish to be eye to eye with the world. But he saw me anyway. He put his arms behind him, thrusting his hands into his sleeves so he would not have to shake hands with me. The closer he came, the higher rose his head. When we finally stood face to face, he looked at me intently. He was so moved his nostrils seemed to quiver, but he kept silent. Among the Mussarists, when you ask, "How are you?" the question means, what is the state of your religious life? Have you risen in spirituality? But I had forgotten and asked quite simply, "Hirsch Rasaner, how are you?" Hirsch moved back a little, looked me over from head to toe, saw that I was modishly dressed, and shrugged. "And how are you, Chaim Vilner?" My question, you see, is more important. My lips trembled and I answered hotly, "Your question, Hirsch Rasaner, is no question at all. I do what I have to." Right there in the middle of the street, he cried out, "Do you think, Chaim Vilner, that by running away from the yeshiva you have saved yourself? You know the saying among us, whoever has learned Mussar can have no enjoyment in his life. You will always be deformed, Chaim Vilner. You will remain a cripple the rest of your life. You write godless verses, they reward you by patting you on the cheek. Now they're stuffing you with applause, as they would stuff a goose with grain. They make a fuss about you, you're treated like a child born in his parents' old age, but later you'll see, when you've begun to go to their school, oh, won't the worldly ones beat you? Which of you isn't hurt by criticism? Is there one of you really so self-confident that he doesn't go around begging for some authority's approval? Is there one of you who's prepared to publish his book anonymously? The big thing with you people is that your name should be seen and known. You have given up our tranquility of spirit for what? For passions you will never be able to satisfy, and for doubts you will never be able to answer, no matter how much you suffered. So part of this is just, it's a critique of this pleasure, right? We spoke about in the introduction to Mussar that it's about kind of breaking out of this like pleasure-pain, push-pull. And part of what Hirsch Rasaner here is saying to Chaim Vilner, the narrator, character of the story, is you think that you're pursuing pleasure and that's going to feed you and nourish you in some way, but pleasure is actually always wrapped up in pain, and that even as you kind of make it, you at the same time are becoming dependent on these people for their approval. And once you become dependent on these people for approval and for your pleasure, then the minute they move on to the next person, or the minute they don't approve of you, you're going to be experiencing pain all over again. And it's not, and that's actually what it's about. And his argument for how you know that that's what it's about is that no one will publish anonymously. You're in it for the approval, and you're in it for your name to be big, and that's why no one will publish anonymously, and that's how you know that you're in it for the pleasure. But pleasure is meaningless because pleasure and pain are inseparable. And so really his argument is like you have to just take in the self-abnegation. You have to be able to say none of this matters. Pleasure, pain, great. I'm just going to lean into pain. This life of poverty that he's described, the not looking people in the face, not engaging with the world eye to eye. All of that is a description of the Novardak vision of break out of pleasure and pain. Just embrace the pain because none of that matters. When we ask, how are you? I don't mean how are you in the pleasure-pain spectrum? I mean, how are you in your spirituality, which is the only thing that actually matters and is beyond and outside of the pleasure-pain spectrum. And so just embrace the pain side of the pleasure-pain spectrum, live in poverty, doesn't matter, live in isolation, because actually the only thing that will give you fulfillment is spirituality. And so when we ask, how are you? It means, what is the state of your religious life? Okay, back to the story. When he had spoken his fill, Hirsch Seder began to walk away with a quick, energetic stride. But I had once been a Mussarist too, so I ran after him. Hirsch, listen to me now. No one knows better than I how torn you are. You're proud of yourself because you don't care if the whole street laughs at you for wearing your tzitzit down to your ankles. You've talked yourself into believing that the cloth with the woolen fringes is a partition between you and the world. You despise yourself because you're afraid you may find favor in the eyes of the world. That Potiphar's wife. You fear you won't, Potiphar's wife as this paradigm in the Torah of a wow, English is really failing me, as like a seductress, and that the favor in the eyes of the world is this like seductive thing, and really what you should do is just let the world laugh at you because who cares? It's not important. And favor in the eyes of the world is just seducing you away from the things that actually are important. You fear you won't have the strength to tear yourself away like the righteous Joseph. So you flee from temptation and you think the world will run after you. But when you see that the world doesn't run after you, you become angry and cry out, nobody enjoys life. You want to console yourself with that idea. So this is the Chaim Vilner's kind of critique of Mussar, is like you think like you're leading all these people, and actually, right, like I'm interested in approval of the world and I know it. And you pretend to not be interested in the approval of the world, but when the world then doesn't approve of you, you get upset. And so you just say, oh, this is how it's meant to be. Nobody enjoys life. And you look for consolation in that, but it's false. When you live in solitude in your garret, that's because you would rather have nothing at all than take the crumb that life throws you. Your modesty is pride, not self-denial. Hirsch Seder responds, and who told you that I seek pleasure? I seek a truth you don't, oh sorry, no, this is Vilner continuing. And who told you that I seek pleasure? I seek a truth you don't have. For that matter, I didn't run away. I simply returned to my own street, to Yatkov Street in Vilna. I love the porters with their backs broken from carrying their burdens, the artisans pouring sweat at their workbenches, the market women who would cut off a finger to give a poor man a crust of bread. But you scold the hungry for being sinners, and all you can tell them is to repent. You laugh at people who work because you say they don't trust in God. But you live on what others have made. Women exhausted with work bring you something to eat, and in return you promise them the world to come. Hirsch Seder, you have long since sold your share in the world to come to those poor women. Hirsch Seder gave a start and disappeared. I returned to Vilna with a burden removed from my conscience. Okay, so this, I cut out like a whole bunch of the story here, but just another like moment in the story that I wanted to turn to where again we have another description of kind of Navardak ideology. So that's this next part, and it's Hirsch Rasainer, who's the person who's kind of still in the Navardak Mussarist world speaking. So here he goes. A man may tell himself, I don't live according to a reason, but according to the law. And he may feel certain that when temptation comes, he'll look into the appropriate book to see what he should do, and he'll do it. He tells himself that he is free. Actually, the freedom of his choice goes no farther than his wish. Even a man who has a law won't be able to withstand his temptation if he doesn't watch over himself day and night. He who knows all secrets, that's God, knew that our father Abraham would stand ready to sacrifice Isaac, but only after the binding did the angel say to Abraham, now I know. Hence we learn that until a man has accomplished what he should, the law does not trust him. A child has the capacity to grow, but we don't know how tall he'll grow. His father and mother may be as high as trees, but he may favor a dwarf grandfather. Only by good deeds can we drive out bad deeds. Therefore the Jews cried out at Sinai, we will do, only do, always do, and we will obey. And now we want to know what the law tells us to do. Without deeds, all inquiry is vain. That is the outlook and the moral way of the old one, Reb Joseph Yoizel. He's the founder of Navardak. May his spirit be a shield for us. And thousands of students at Navardak steep themselves in it day and night. We labored to make ourselves better. Each of us polished and filed his own soul, with examiners gathering evidences of improvement like pearls. So the piece of this that I wanted to bring out, what he's describing here, is that Mussar is very practical. It's not just about thinking certain things. It's not just inside of your head. There's these real kind of actions. So for example, the Chaim Vilner character described Hirsch Rasainer wearing his tzitzit like to the floor out in public where people would laugh at him. That's considered an action. Like that's a thing that you're doing that helps kind of degrade you in the eyes of the world, which was considered a good thing in the like Navardak mindset. And so here what Rasainer is saying is, yeah, you can't just think like, oh, self-abnegation is good. You actually have to, like the stories from Navardak are like, people would go to a hardware store and ask to buy a bagel. Like just to go and do embarrassing things in public in order to remind themselves that it doesn't matter. That embarrassment doesn't matter, that what other people think of you doesn't matter. All that matters is growing in your spirituality and in your religious life. But you can't just like tell yourself, oh, it doesn't matter, oh, it doesn't matter. No, you have to go and like do actions. And what Rasainer here is describing is that actually there are examiners in the yeshiva who would be like a mashpia or a mashkiach who would give you feedback on how well you're doing and on how well your actions are reflecting your spiritual growth and development. So it wasn't just a individual kind of striving towards something that would happen in private. It was like public, and it was overseen and cultivated, and people would like take notice, and then you'd have this kind of like outside reinforcement on the successes of your self-abnegation. It's just a very interesting kind of educational model, but an extremely harsh one that really you don't see it very much now, let's say. But that's in some ways because, and that's why I wanted to turn now to Slobodka, in some ways the alumni of Slobodka were more influential than Navardak. Like I don't know that Navardak like really survived the war in quite the way that Slobodka did. So I'm just going to read this paragraph. The next thing I have here is about Slobodka. I wanted to read this paragraph. Institutionally, Mussar took center stage at the Slobodka Yeshiva, founded in 1881 in a suburb of Kovno by Natan Tzvi Finkel, a disciple of Broda known as their altar. The altar of Slobodka, if you know the pictures we have downstairs in Shlansky, there's like portraits, so that he's one of them. Fingal's teaching stressed respect for human dignity and cultivation of a positive self-image as a prerequisite for one's religious life, as well as for spiritual fellowship with others. So completely the opposite of the Vardak, right? So I'll just read that again, right? Positive self-image, respect for human dignity as a prerequisite for religious life, and spiritual fellowship with others. So this really fits in much better with kind of the way we think about the world today. The yeshiva at Slobodka was explicitly committed to Mussar, expressed both in Fingal's intense interest in the moral and spiritual development of each student, and in the formal incorporation of Mussar study into the curriculum. The study at Slobodka of moral texts such as Moshe Chaim Lutzato's Mesilat Yesharim and Bachya ibn Pekuda's Chovot HaLevavot reflected the ecstatic mode of text study that gave Mussar learning its distinctive ambiance. During the half hour accorded daily to Mussar study, students would engage in paroxysms of self-exhortation, shout a line or two of text over and over, pound the walls, and gesticulate in a frenzy. One thing that is a Mussar practice that people today have really embraced, who are kind of in the modern, there's a group of people in the modern Orthodox world who are really trying to bring the Slobodka vision of Mussar study back, and they really emphasize like mantras, this repetition of a line over and over again until you like fully kind of taken it in, activated it in your life in all sorts of different ways, and that's very much like a Slobodka kind of method. And just this list of the well-known graduates in the Slobodka Yeshiva, so Yitzchak Hutner, Avram and Eliyahu Kaplan, Yaakov Kamenetsky, Aaron Cutler, Saul Lieberman, one of the most important luminaries of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and Yechiel Weinberg, who is the Sridei Eish, and a very important post-war kind of posek for that generation. So we have some of just like the greats of the American Haredi world, Yitzchak Hutner, who's the Pachad Yitzchak, Aaron Cutler, and right, Saul Lieberman, Yechiel Weinberg. Like these are kind of the biggest names. Yeah.
Is Aaron Cutler the Cutler who founded the Lakewood Yeshiva?
Yeah. Yeah. So just like these are people you've heard of.
Yeah.
And so they're all graduates of Slobodka, and this list could keep going. Like really, some of the older generation of like what's his name at Yeshivat HaKotel. There's still today. He's alive and I think still teaching. A graduate of Slobodka. Like the last generation of people who were because also you would start in these yeshivot very young. Like this is not like a post-high school kind of thing. This is like at 13 you would matriculate into these yeshivot, or possibly even younger. So people who in World War, at the beginning of World War II were maybe 15, those people are still alive, or and kind of at the ends of their careers now. But some of these people are still, some of the graduates of Slobodka are still around. Or not, they didn't graduate Slobodka, but they studied at Slobodka, and they're kind of still around also, which is interesting, and they've been very influential, and I think some of the reason why like the Torah study that we have now is so embracing of this language of human dignity and human grandeur and confidence is I think really due to that, really due to the influence of Slobodka. So. But it didn't produce a great author who could write about it in the way that Grata could write about Vardak. So, what were you gonna say? Okay, so I wanted to look at, there's sort of a library of Mussar texts, and I had to make a decision because there were the texts that were studied in these yeshivot, which are from before their founding, meaning the Mesilas Yesharim is from 100 years before the founding of Mussar. But that's what they were actually studying in these yeshivot. Or there's texts about Mussar that were written by the leaders of these yeshivas. So I went with the Mesilat Yesharim just because it's kind of a classic. It's easier to get your hands on for sure, especially in translation. But there's really a great deal of Mussar literature out there, and I would say there's Mussar literature that's being produced today. I've studied a little bit. There's a book called the Afike Mayim that it's continuing to come out, and what I love about that literature is it's very much engaged with like in some ways with like the modern world, the struggles of modern man, and it's deeply kind of psychological, and I find something like very fun about that. And a lot of the more modern books are much more explaining. We'll see how the Mesilat, we're going to read the introduction, and he talks about how you're supposed to read the book. And modern works of Mussar will even be more explicit because, again, what we saw from the Grata story about how it's all about action, that's true for Mussar writ large, for everyone. No matter whether Mussar makes you walk like this or makes you walk like this, it's still all about these kind of practices that, there's no point in studying Mussar if it doesn't change you, and the only way you can tell whether it's changed you or not is if you can see changes in your actions. And so a lot of modern Mussar literature will even come with like a practical element. Every Mussar class I've ever taken, so even there was one yeshiva that we're actually going to talk about next week with Rabbi Wokenfeld that was not into Mussar, and that is Volozhin. And the descendants of Volozhin are the founders of the institutions that I grew up in, so like the Maimonides school, the like yeshiva university world. Like you will not really find Mussar being taught there, because in Volozhin it was like all Talmud all the time, and they had their own philosophy of brisk, which actually it predates Mussar and influenced Salanter in certain ways, but Mussar was not a thing in Volozhin. It was not studied. They did not give up time from their Talmud study to study Mussar and to work on these kinds of practices. So in the world that I grew up in, it was like Talmud or bust, and like why would I do something practical when I could like learn more text? And so when I was first introduced to Mussar, and we were given these like practical things, like go with your chavrusa and make a commitment to yourself that you're going to work on this one character trait, and you're going to keep a journal of all the times where you did it well and did it poorly for the next week, and you're going to check in on each other. I was like, this is a stupid waste of time. That's when I first started learning Mussar. And then 2 years later, I took another Mussar class and was a little bit more like, I wasn't 17 anymore, and I was a little bit more mature and open-minded about what could be included in the world of Torah. And then I started much more taking it seriously. And the practice of like the journaling practices involved and the having to disclose your progress to another person element of it, I felt was incredibly powerful and very scary. Even when your Mussar Chavrusa is a good friend and someone you trust and someone you know is only there to like help you grow as a human, it's still a lot. So all is to say. And so then, and then I continued, my Rosh Hashiva at Maharat was very interested in Mussar as well. And with him, we also would have these kind of, every week we would meet, we would study a text, we would review the homework in progress made since the week before, and we would like be assigned homework for the next week. So there's always homework when you study Mussar, and that was carried out like either in Slobodka we just read about with these like repeated lines yelled out over and over again, because what you're trying to do is to integrate it. And how do you then integrate these ideas, and how do you create character change, which is actually really, really hard to do. So it often involves like very public kind of activities. Anyways, I maybe should have said all that at the beginning, but whatever. Okay, so anyways, we're going to look at the Mesilas Yesharim. This is the text that's studied in every kind of Mussar context. Mussar is a word that kind of exists. It predates Salanter, meaning he did not invent this word. It's a word that exists even in Tanakh, and it was already a brand of literature with Ibn Pakuda and Moshe Chaim Lutzato and others, but the practice of how to like bring it into the yeshiva as half an hour a day we're going to study this, that was kind of the innovation of Salanter, and this orientation about particularly to leave Kabbalah behind and say the focus needs to be there are mitzvot, and I am not people are not born ready to kind of fully embrace mitzvot until they can overcome this like pleasure, pain, push, pull. and then the work of actually doing that. Okay, so here's the Mesilat Yesharim. I think we'll just mostly read it in English. So he writes about. So he opened. Okay, actually we're gonna get there. But so where we're gonna look to his introduction is rather long, and I took bits and pieces of it. But the first thing we're going to look at is how he thinks this book should be studied. So he says, the benefit derived from this book comes from review and diligent study. For then he'll be reminded of these things which, by nature, people tend to forget. And he will put to heart his duties which he hides from. Meaning his argument is that this book, if you just read it straight through, you'll be like, everything, if you read it straight through just for the ideas of the book, you'll be like, this is really obvious, okay, like, next. And his sense is like, this is not a work. Let me see that. This is the author, Moshe Chaim Tzadok, saying, this is not a work that you study because there's innovative ideas in it. There are no innovative ideas. It's just that everything in here are things that people like to forget about. And so in order to not forget about them, and in order to become his goal is for you to become a better, truer servant of the Almighty, you actually need to review them. And here's why. If you reflect on the current state of affairs in most of the world, you will see most people of quick intelligence and sharp mentality devote most of their thought and interest in the subtleties of wisdom and the depths of analysis, every man according to his intellectual tendency and natural desire. Consequently, this study and the reading of books of this sort, right, he knows there's like a genre of literature that's like his, is left to people of not so keen, almost dull intelligence. And we see this this is not foreign, like we see this kind of playing out in the in the Orthodox community today and all sorts of places, like, who reads these like books of Mussar, like women, or like people who are not like, people who like can't hack it somewhere else, like they're the ones who work on their characters. And it's like, his argument is, no, like everyone needs to work on their character. And so, anyways, okay. Although the beginnings and foundations of piety are already implanted in every upright person's heart, nevertheless, if he does not engage himself in their study, he will encounter its branches but won't recognize them, and he will tread over them without perceiving that he is doing so. So what he's trying to say is, again, like there's nothing new in this book. You will read it and you will say, everything here is obvious and I know it. And yet, when you're making decisions about how to live your life, you won't necessarily make the right decisions unless the material that's going to be described here is in the forefront. So he says, I found that our sages of blessed memory have encompassed all of these divisions of divine service in different words arranged according to the order of steps needed to properly acquire them. And so then this is the table of contents of his book, basically. It's taught in a Breita. From here, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair derived, Torah brings to watchfulness, Torah mivi'ah lidei zehirut. So the first trait he describes is zehirut, is watchfulness. Watchfulness brings to zeal. Zehirut mivi'ah lidei zrizut. Zeal brings to cleanliness. Zrizut mivi'ah lidei nikiyut. Cleanliness brings to separation. Nikiyut mivi'ah lidei prishut. Separation brings to purity. Prishut mivi'ah lidei tahara. Purity brings to piety. Tahara mivi'ah lidei chasidut. Piety brings to humility. Chasidut mivi'ah lidei anava. Humility brings to fear of sin. Anava mivi'ah lidei yirat chit. Fear of sin brings to holiness. Yirat chit mivi'ah lidei kedusha. Holiness brings to the Holy Spirit. Kedusha mivi'ah lidei Ruach HaKodesh, and the Holy Spirit brings to the revival of the dead. Ruach HaKodesh mivi'ah lidei tchiyat hamitim. On the basis of this Breita, I have undertaken to compose this work, to teach myself and to remind others the conditions of perfect service according to their proper levels. I will clarify the nature of each one of them, its divisions and details, the way to acquire it, its detrimental factors, and the way to guard against them, so that I, and whoever else finds it pleasing, may read it in order to learn to fear the Lord our God and not forget our duty to Him. What the natural physicality exerts itself to remove from our hearts, the reading and reflecting will remind us and awaken us to that which we have been commanded. So again, what the natural physicality exerts itself to remove from our hearts, the reading and reflecting will remind us and awaken us to that which we have been commanded. So first of all, he's saying, this is stuff that's naturally there, but we also, over the course of our lives, for all these reasons, override it or ignore it. So this needs to bring it back into our hearts, and you can't just read, right? He's both kriya requires also histaklut. If you read this and don't think, where have I seen this in my life? When have I had this experience? Does this resonate with me? And then say, how do I improve myself? How do I strive to be better? So it's not just reading, it's this very active reading with tremendous introspection and introspective work. That's what the Mesilat Yesharim requires of you. And that really is the work of all of the brands of Mussar that existed and that found this text to be so central to them. Okay, so I just had to make a decision because we couldn't look at the whole book, but I do recommend it. It's fully available in English online. Sefaria has a full English translation. You can buy many. We have an English translation in the library here. Yeah.
What's the name in English?
The Path of the Just, I think, is usually what it's called. Okay. But even the English translations will often have Mesilat Yesharim or Mesilas Yesharim as on it. I think we have a full, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I've read this book, not as much depth as I should have, but I've read it.
Well, he would say read it again.
Yeah, I should read it again. But that book, if I remember correctly, and there are two books he wrote. Yeah. Which present the fundamental ideas of traditional Judaism. And how does this connect to Mussar?
So this text was studied by the Mussar movement. So right. What you're asking is, right, how does this connect to Mussar in the sense that when he was writing it, he wasn't writing it for the Mussar movement. Correct, he's 100 years before the Mussar movement. Mm-hmm. But when the Mussar movement was looking for core literature, this was it. So this was text that was read by the Mussar movement and kind of taken in as in the way that when you want to know what the Parsha is, you study the Torah. So too, like when you want to know how to do Mussar, you look to this text. And it was the creation, almost like the creation of like activated communities around the Mesilat Yesharim. But and really not like, it's not a radical, but what's so beautiful about what the Mussar movement did with this text is that it's not a radical reread of the Mesilat Yesharim at all. It's just a taking of this text and putting it and forefronting it and saying this text is really important and we're going to make this text central, right? Because the Jewish library is vast. You could, live your whole life and only study other things. And the Muslim movement said, no, this is what you have to study. Like this guy had it straight on. And the creation then of not just like activated communities, but also like a method for how to, and different yeshivot had different methodologies, as I've tried to kind of describe, for how to really take the ideas of Mutato and the ideas of other people, Ibn Pekuda and others, and really like put them into the hearts of their followers.
For this shiur, my limited and very superficial knowledge of Mussar associated it with ethical behavior. And how does that fit in to what we've been talking about?
I think in some ways ethics is a misnomer for Mussar, meaning when I was a philosophy major as an undergrad, and when I studied ethics, we discussed like trolley problems, like you're the conductor of a trolley, and if you go straight, you'll kill 5 people, but if you pull the lever, you'll only kill 1, and those kinds of problems. The Mussar movement's investment in that is, I would say, minimal. Maybe it's about cultivating you to be the type of person who will make the right decision. But in terms of sitting around kind of philosophizing about whether you should like pull the lever or not, that's completely not of interest to the Mussar movement. So what we sometimes think of as like contemporary ethics, like I think is confusing language to use. When we're talking about the Mussar movement. The Mussar movement is interested in the creation of like perfected human beings, and that's what they mean by ethics. So as opposed to, but the point of that for them is compliance with Torah and mitzvot, not and possibly and not like the ethical questioning of Torah and mitzvot, meaning like not sort of like I don't think you would find someone in the Muslim movement sitting around saying, well, did Abraham do the right thing in binding Isaac, or like was God wrong to harden the heart of Pharaoh? These kinds of ethical questions that we like to ask about the Torah. The Muslim movement, I don't think, is particularly interested in those questions.
Is it rather that if one perfects oneself and eliminates as much as possible one's character flaws, one will be a good person?
Yes.
And relate to others in a beneficent rather than a malignant way.
So I think Slobodka definitely would embrace that read. Navardak less so. Navardak would say your interactions with others in some ways are full of pleasure seeking, and we're not interested in pleasure seeking. That's a distraction. Whereas Slobodka would say, yes, and the reason why I'm trying to cultivate you is so that you can be in fellowship with others, and so that you can be graced with dignity for yourself and a recognition of the dignity in others. But those are both iterations of the Mussar movement. So that's what's complicated about it, is that what ties together the different places that are all called Mussar was, I think, like a commitment to the same sort of like internal work of self-improvement, one, two, a real like disregard for Kabbalah as part of that process, three, a feeling of connectedness to Salander, and to like the inheritance of Salander, and the sense of like you have to actually like work at it. Like you can't just like study things, you have to practice them. But in terms of like what the output of that is, I think it was quite different depending on what school of thought you came from within the Mussar movement. And not to say that like people were bad people, like they weren't, like there's amazing kind of stories about Salanter and his students doing incredible acts of kindness for other people, but the reason why they would do that is not because they like studied ethics. It would be because they ethically perfected themselves and therefore strove to like do good for others as a way to serve God. I think that would be like the better way to say that. Okay, so just to look quickly at Zrizut, which is, I find it to be, his writing about Zrizut to be very helpful, because I am inherently a very lazy person. And so this is chapter 5. So Achar Zehirut Ba'az Zrizut, after watchfulness comes zeal, for watchfulness revolves around the negative mitzvot. It's guarding yourself from doing wrong, while zeal revolves around the positive mitzvot. This is as it's written, sur meira v'aseh tov. So zehirut is about sur meira, it's about watchfulness is about turning from evil, whereas zeal is about kind of more proactively doing good. So he describes the lazy person, who doesn't sound that bad, right? That's what's tricky about laziness in this. He thus says, I will eat a bit, or I will sleep a little, or it is difficult for me to leave my house. I've put off my coat, how shall I put it on again? That's a quote from Song of Songs. It's very hot outside, it's very cold, it's raining, and all other sorts of excuses and rationalizations that the mouths of lazy people are full of. Either way, in the meantime, the Torah is abandoned, the service of God is idle, and man abandons his creator. This is what Shlomo said, by laziness the ceiling decays, and through lowering of the hands the house leaks. That is from Ecclesiastes. So if you ask the lazy person to explain his behavior, he will confront you with numerous quotations of the sages, verses from scripture, and logical arguments, all of which instruct him, according to his distorted mind, to be lenient with himself and to leave himself in the tranquility of his laziness. So just as like a Mussar practice that I work on and contemplate a lot, is that we live in a world where we talk about self-care a lot, and we have all of these kind of logical arguments about why it's really important to kind of not do, to take a step back and to and to relax. And then on the other hand, you have language like this, which is you have to question where that's coming from really carefully. Because if he fails to see that all these arguments and reasons do not stem from balanced reasoning, but rather spring from the wellspring of laziness, which, as it strengthens over him, inclines his view and intellect to those arguments, right? So it gets strengthened as you make space for it. Hence, he fails to heed the voice of the wise and men of sound judgment. This is what Shlomo screams out: the lazy man is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men that answer sensibly. That's from Mishlei, Proverbs. For laziness does not allow him to be even concerned for the words of those who rebuke him. Rather, he will consider them all to be mistaken or foolish, while he alone is the wise one. Know that this is a fundamental principle, well tested by experience in the art of separation. Every leniency must be carefully investigated. For even though it is possible that it is justified and correct, nevertheless, it is more likely to be the advice of the evil inclination and its deceit. So he allows, it's possible that by taking a step back, by not doing something, by allowing yourself to do something that seems like not as active as it could possibly be, that could be the right thing. But because we have this pull towards atzlanut, towards laziness, we have to always be asking ourselves, is that the pull of laziness? Or is it actually a well-reasoned, well-considered decision for me that's based on wisdom to make whatever decision I am? And if after all this it still stands meritorious, then certainly it is good, right? So he leaves open the possibility that there is, like, quote unquote, a laziness or laxities that are good, but he also says you have to really investigate them carefully, and giving into it misguidedly is very dangerous because it's comfortable. It's comfortable to not, if I told you that the same outcome would come if you exercised or if you didn't exercise, then you would never exercise, right? Because we're always pulled towards not doing something. But then you have to ask yourself, is my fundamental assumption that exercise and not exercise have the same outcome? Is that right? and because you're always going to be pulled towards some justification for doing the lazier thing. That pull is going to be much stronger, and the more you give into it, the stronger it will become. It really feeds on itself. So the more you can justify, I'll go to the gym tomorrow. Oh, it's been a month and I haven't gone to the gym. Oh, nothing's happened. I guess it's okay to never go to the gym, right? Like, we see that in our lives. It's very easy to get there, and it totally feeds on itself. And then you've become a person who doesn't go to the gym. Oh, okay. And so you really, with every decision, have to wonder where it stems from and whether it's actually right, and what is actually that voice in your head that's speaking and encouraging you. So summary of the matter: a man must greatly strengthen himself and fortify himself with zeal in doing mitzvot by casting off himself the weight of laziness which impedes him. And so after studying this text, you might do some kind of activity, like for the next week, every time you had an inclination to do something that might be lazy, you would write it down, and then you would try and think it through and really interrogate it. What is the source of this inclination that I have? And then you might sit with a friend or a teacher and have them kind of check your work and see did I actually make the right decisions here, or where did I fail and how's it gone wrong? And then maybe you would just keep working on it over time. And then maybe if you're in Slobodka, then you would repeat this line, Chizuk gadol tzarich adam lichazik likaber bizrizut la'asot hamitzvot. Right? You would maybe that line would be something that you would repeat over and over again in order to, right? That line says you have to greatly strengthen yourself and fortify yourself, and maybe the repetition of that line, screaming it out in public, would actually help you to overcome it. So that would be also, it wouldn't just be the tracking of am I getting this right or not? But it would also be the kind of stated commitment, mantra, statement that would help you get there. And that might be, just as an example of a practice someone might do for casting off the weight of laziness, that impedes him. So I feel like this is like it really speaks to me, and I think it speaks to one of the challenges of our time that secular society says like just take care of yourself, like it's good. And Judaism also has a voice that says take care of yourself. God gave you one body, you're its caretaker. God gave you one mind, you're its caretaker also. You have to take care of yourself. And at the same time, that voice where is that voice coming from? What is at the root of that voice? It's really important to kind of interrogate and wonder about and to make decisions not based on it feels really comfortable to sit on the couch and watch Netflix right now, but is this actually serving me, and am I becoming a better person for it, and am I becoming a better servant of God because of this? Because of this tradition. So there's a ton more to say about the Mussar movement in terms of just its philosophy or its varied philosophies. I've tried to kind of suggest that there are sort of unifying forces within the Mussar movement, but also like you could really, like I think if I were teaching a course for a semester about Mussar, we would look at its founding and then we'd spend a lot of time in Nevardak, and a lot of time in Slobodka, and a lot of time in Kelm, which we didn't talk about at all. It's kind of it didn't kind of last as long or leave as great a literary legacy. That's kind of why not. But the Mussar movement was very important, and I would say that we still definitely feel its influence today, not just through the amazing people that were sort of created in these yeshivot and grew up in these yeshivot, but also through the literature that they kind of brought to the fore within the Jewish library, that they created themselves within the Jewish library. And I think it really has a lot to speak to us today when character development is a really important subject for everyone in our own times, and for people for whom even when other types of Jewish texts, this was the great push of these yeshivot, which is, it's not that I don't like the Talmud, so I study Mussar. It's that in order to truly live a life of Torah mitzvot, I have to also study Mussar in addition to the Talmud. That would be their argument, and I think my tendency is to agree and to say like this type of work and these type of texts should be part of everyone's kind of regular practice in some way or another, and that the improvement of the self is as important a part of Judaism as any other, insofar as it leads to greater connection to God and practice of Torah and mitzvot. Okay, thanks for going. Yeah, please.
A question about Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who you identify with Amsterdam. Perhaps I was mistaken. I associated him with Italy. Is that?
Oh, that's Shlomo David Luzzatto. That's a different person.
Got it.
I don't remember whether they're related, but the Shadal is also a Torah commentator, a beautiful Torah commentator. I think earlier also, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, different people. Yeah, good question. All right.